My name is Ensley Woods, and I was 28 years old when a neighbor called to tell me my grandmother had died because my own parents didn't think I needed to know. 10 years earlier, just 2 weeks after my 18th birthday, my mother and father had placed 2 suitcases on the front porch, changed the locks, and left me standing there with my backpack in my hands. Now they were sitting in the front pew at Nana's funeral, and my mother was squeezing my hand like she'd done it every day for a decade, whispering, "We should talk about the estate, sweetheart." As a family, they thought they were coming back for money. What they walked into was the one room in America where my grandmother could still speak for herself. And what the judge read aloud on page 4, that part nobody in my family saw coming, including me. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where family secrets come to light and quiet people finally get their say. If you've ever been made to feel like you owed your family your whole life, this one is for you. Drop a comment below, tell me where you're listening from, and be sure to subscribe. I was on shift when Ruth called. I'm a hospice nurse, and that Tuesday in March, I was sitting with a patient across the county, holding his hand through the quiet of 4 in the morning when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I stepped into the hallway and answered. Ruth Delgado had lived next door to my grandmother for 30 years, and she was crying so hard I couldn't understand her at first. Marlene Woods died in her sleep, she finally managed. Sometime before dawn. Peacefully in her own bed in her own house, which was the only way she ever would have accepted it. Then Ruth said the part that put ice in my spine. "Honey, your parents have known since 7 this morning. I waited all day for you to come. When you didn't, I figured nobody told you. It was after 4 in the afternoon. 9 hours. My grandmother had been gone for 9 hours, and the 2 people who called themselves her family had let me find out from a neighbor. I drove the 20 minutes to Maple Glen with my hands steady on the wheel, because hospice teaches you to fall apart later, on your own time. Her porch light was on. It clicked on every evening at 7, and it was burning now against the dark like nothing in the world had changed. On the front door, someone had taped an index card written in my mother's tidy loan officer handwriting. Contents inventoried. Please do not remove items. Signed G and P Woods. She had been dead less than a day. My parents had already made a list of everything inside that house. I stood on that porch for a long time, staring at the card, and remembered the last time I'd stood there with suitcases at my feet. To understand why that moment mattered, you have to know what kind of house I grew up in. In my mother's kitchen, taped to the refrigerator where other families put crayon drawings, there was an invoice. She started it the month I turned 16. Room and board, $150 a month. Itemized in blue ink, with a running balance at the bottom. My mother had been a loan officer for 20 years, and she ran our family the way she ran her desk. Birthday gifts came with reminders. That coat wasn't cheap, Ensley. Remember what we do for you. Every kindness was recorded somewhere, gathering interest. My dad never argued with the system. He sat behind his newspaper at the table like a man waiting out bad weather. And whenever I looked to him, he gave me that small, apologetic shrug, as if the ledger were a law of nature instead of his wife's handwriting. Then there was Nana's kitchen, 6 streets away. Saturday mornings meant pancakes on a griddle older than my father, coupons clipped and sorted into a shoebox, and coffee so weak you could practically read a newspaper through it. I asked her once, when I was maybe 12, what I owed her for gas money after she'd driven me to a school event. She laughed so hard she had to sit down. "Eat your pancakes," she said. "You don't owe me a thing. You never will." Same last name. Same town. 2 completely different countries. I spent my childhood crossing the border between them, wondering why love cost so much in one house and nothing at all in the other. I didn't have the word for it then. I just knew that in one kitchen I was a daughter and in the other I was a debt. And in the spring of 2014, those 2 countries went to war. In April 2014, when I was 17, Nana had a minor stroke. The doctor said it had affected the edge of her speech for a few weeks and left her right hand slower than she liked. She attacked recovery the same way she attacked a sale bin at the grocery store, with a list, determination, and absolutely no patience. Every afternoon after school, I drove her to physical therapy in her old Buick. That was how I got a front row seat to what my parents did next. My mother showed up at the hospital carrying a folder. Inside were brochures for a place called Willow Crest Senior Living and a printed estimate from a realtor for Nana's house. And that was the first moment I realized my grandmother wasn't just recovering from a stroke. She was being treated like an asset someone was already planning to divide. Nana was still slurring her words, and my mother was already pricing the walls around her. She told relatives she was simply getting ahead of things. She told the doctors she was the responsible one in the family. She used the word manage so many times that eventually it stopped sounding like a verb and started sounding like a threat. Nana said no. Slowly, clearly she said no. And that should have been the end of it. Except a few weeks later, I came downstairs one night for water and heard my parents at the kitchen table with a calculator out. My mother was saying words I had never heard before. Petition, power of attorney, guardianship. My dad said, "If you think it's best, Pam." I was 17. I stood in the dark hallway of the Ledger House, pulled out my phone and looked up those words. My stomach dropped through the floor. My mother wasn't planning to help her mother-in-law recover. She was planning to ask a court to declare Nana incompetent, take control of her money, and sell her house. 3 weeks later, she filed the papers for real. But here's what my parents didn't count on. When someone asks an Ohio court to declare another person incompetent, the court doesn't simply take their word for it. Someone comes to investigate. In Nana's case, it was a tired-looking woman with kind eyes and a clipboard. She came to the house on a Thursday in July while I was there after therapy. She watched Nana make coffee, pay her water bill at the kitchen table, and answer questions about the current president, the year, and the exact price of ground beef at Hartman's Grocery, which Nana considered the only current event that mattered. Then the investigator asked to speak with me privately on the porch. I was 17, but I understood with perfect clarity that both countries were listening. So I told her the truth. I told her Nana cooked her own meals, balanced her own checkbook, managed her appointments, and knew exactly what was happening in her life. I showed her the little school notebook where I'd been keeping our therapy schedule, every session logged in gel pen, 5 months of Tuesdays and Thursdays. I told her my grandmother was the most competent person I knew and that nobody in that house needed managing. Dr. Patel, Nana's doctor for 20 years, told the court the same thing in writing. In August 2014, the petition was denied. Nana kept her house, her money, and, most importantly, her right to make her own decisions. My mother didn't scream. That's the thing people get wrong about her. She came out of the courthouse with her chin level, drove me home in a silence you could practically stand a spoon in, and at a red light, without turning her head, said one quiet sentence. "You'll learn what loyalty costs, Ensley." I thought it was just something bitter people said when they lost. 2 months later, I discovered it was an invoice. I turned 18 at the end of September. 2 weeks later, I came home from my shift at the pancake barn, and my key didn't work. The porch light at the Ledger House was off, but I could see the shapes waiting on the welcome mat. 2 suitcases packed neatly, with my old junior year backpack sitting on top like a bow. My mother opened the door around 4. The chain was still on, and she wasn't angry. She was composed, the same way she looked at her desk when she declined somebody's loan. "You're 18 now," she said. "You made your choice in that courtroom. Family is a ledger, Ensley, and you are deep in the red." Behind her, at the edge of the hallway light, I could see my dad's shadow behind the curtain, completely still. And that shadow told me everything about him I would ever need to know. The door closed. The deadbolt turned. I stood on the porch of the house I had grown up in doing math no 18-year-old should have to do. How much was in my checking account? Whose couch could I ask to sleep on? How many shifts would it take to save first and last month's rent? Then I picked up the suitcases and walked 6 streets through the October darkness. At 11 that night, I knocked on Nana's door. She opened it wearing her robe. She looked at me, looked at the suitcases, and didn't ask a single question. She simply reached past me, flipped a switch, and turned on the porch light above my head. "Warm. Yellow. Teddy. Love doesn't keep books, honey," she said. "It keeps a light on." From that night forward, for the rest of her life, that light burned every single evening so I would always know which house was mine. And I want to tell you something. The next 10 years weren't some glamorous transformation where everything suddenly worked out. They were mostly just long. I lived in Nana's spare room for a year, then moved into a tiny studio apartment, worked through nursing school, pulled overnight shifts, studied between patients, and slowly built a life that didn't require anyone's permission. Nana was there through all of it, not paying my bills, not rescuing me, but doing something far more important. She believed I could carry my own life without ever making me feel like I had to carry hers. She kept that porch light on, and I never forgot what it meant. I lived above the hardware store. I waited tables, took out loans, and put myself through nursing school. I'm proud of that, but I won't pretend it was clean. In November 2015, when I was 19, I broke. It had been 13 months of double shifts and silence from two people whose voices I still heard in my sleep. One night, my hands wouldn't stop shaking, and my thoughts turned into a drain I couldn't climb out of. I drove myself to the county hospital and signed myself in. 72 hours in the behavioral health unit. I signed myself in alone, and 3 days later I signed myself out alone. I told exactly one living soul what had happened, and that person was nobody, not even Nana. I walked out of that building with a rule carved somewhere permanent inside me. Need nothing. Oh, nothing. If no one holds anything of yours, no one can drop it. For the next 10 years, that rule felt like strength. Remember it because it comes back later in a courtroom in the worst possible way. The years stacked up. I earned my nursing license at 22 and found my way into hospice work, which sounds grim to people who've never done it and sacred to everyone who has. Sunday mornings still belonged to Nana's kitchen. Pancakes, weak coffee, and her reading the obituaries aloud like box scores. We had 10 good years. Then, in the fall of 2024, Nana started making appointments she wouldn't explain. She drove herself downtown to see a lawyer named Harriet Cole and came home with her mouth pressed flat, like a woman sealing an envelope. The diagnosis came in October 2024. End-stage congestive heart failure. Nana took the news the way she took an expired coupon, with brief irritation and immediate planning. She chose hospice at home. And because life has a sense of irony, her case went to Corrin County Hospice, the same agency where I worked, though not to me. I want to be precise about that because it matters later. I was never her nurse. Her nurse was a colleague named Dana, who managed her medications and her chart. I was her granddaughter. I did granddaughter things. I cooked. I sat with her. I drove her to appointments. I deliberately lost at gin rummy and got caught doing it anyway. The green kitchen table filled up on a rotation Nana never organized but somehow absolutely commanded. Ruth from next door came by. Carmen Fairfield, who owned the diner, brought pie with opinions attached. Half the silver-haired women in Maple Glen passed through that kitchen like it was a chapel with better snacks. And twice that winter, Nana had Harriet Cole over, and the two of them shut the dining room door for an hour. Whenever I asked what they were doing, Nana waved me off. Paperwork, honey. Old women and paperwork. But one night in February, near the end, she was sitting against her pillows, looking small in a way I hated. She reached out and grabbed my wrist with more strength than she had any business having. When they come smiling, she said, you let Harriet do the talking first. I stared at her. Who, Nana? She looked at me with the same steady expression she'd worn when she faced that court investigator a decade earlier. Promise me. So I promised. 3 weeks later she was gone, and I was standing on her porch reading an index card taped to her front door. My parents ran the funeral like a campaign event. My mother wore the correct black and cried at exactly the right volume, dabbing carefully beneath her eyes to protect her makeup. My father stood at the church entrance shaking hands across Maple Glen, accepting condolences for a woman he had once tried to have declared incompetent. I watched people who didn't know the history squeeze his shoulder and tell him how sorry they were. I sat with Ruth and Carmen. I'd been up all night with a hospice patient, and I was running on the kind of autopilot only hospice nurses understand. That was probably the only reason I didn't flinch when my mother appeared beside me at the casket. 10 years of silence, and she slid her arm through mine as naturally as if we had done it every Sunday. Her perfume hadn't changed. "She looks peaceful," my mother whispered. Then, with the casket barely 18 inches away, she said the words I knew were coming. "We should talk about the estate, sweetheart. As a family." As a family. I hadn't been family since an October night in 2014. But Nana's money didn't know that yet, at least as far as my mother was concerned. Across the aisle, my cousin Kayla, now 26, gave me a tiny wave, then immediately glanced down at her phone. I noticed that too. Hospice teaches you who is grieving for the person and who is already thinking about what the person left behind. I said nothing. I had made a promise about this exact moment, even though I still didn't understand what Nana had been preparing for. 2 days later, the letter arrived. A cream-colored envelope bearing the name of Harriet Cole's law office. And when I opened it, I finally understood why Nana had looked at me that night and told me to let Harriet speak first. The letter was addressed to me, with copies noted to Gregory and Pamela Woods. We were all invited to attend the formal reading of Marlene Woods's estate plan on Thursday at 10 in the morning. My phone rang within the hour. My mother's voice was warm as fresh bread. "We'll pick you up, sweetheart. We should walk in together." I drove myself. Harriet Cole's office was lined with law books and had a coffee machine older than I was. Harriet herself was 66, wore reading glasses on a chain, and carried the general air of a woman who had never once been successfully talked over. My parents arrived in their church clothes. My mother had brought a leather folio, which she kept balanced on her lap the entire time, already prepared for whatever came next. Harriet read the trust without drama. The estate of Marlene Woods, held in the Marlene Woods Revocable Trust, consisted of the house on Sycamore Street, appraised at $475,000, the downtown commercial building that had once housed her fabric shop, the Spool and Thimble, now leased and valued at $610,000, investment accounts totaling $2.29 million, built from 40 years of fabric sales, index funds, and the deep patience of a woman who considered paying retail a moral failure, plus cash and personal property valued at approximately $125,000. Roughly $3.5 million in total. And every dollar of it, the house, the building, the investments, the cash, all of it, went to me. Ensley Woods, sole beneficiary. Gregory and Pamela Woods received $10,000 each, with one additional sentence. With my thanks for the lesson they taught me in 2014. The room went so quiet I could hear the coffee machine cycling behind us. I sat there with my ears ringing and watched my mother. 10 years of missing someone teaches you to watch them. She didn't flinch. She smiled, reached over, took my hand in both of hers, and said in a voice warm as a heating pad, "Oh, sweetheart, what a responsibility for you. Of course, we'll manage it for you." As if Nana had left the money to me with an errand attached for them. I gently took my hand back. "No, thank you." My mother kept smiling as she gathered her coat. And that smile scared me more than the inventory notice on Nana's door. It was the smile of a woman who already had a plan. Her first move wasn't a lawyer. It was casserole diplomacy. That Sunday my mother called, and her voice had a register I had never heard directed at me before. And hurried, almost shy. She wanted to have me over for dinner. No business, Ensley. No estate talk. Just family. "I've missed you." I want to be honest about what happened inside my chest when she said that, because I think some of you already understand. I was 28 years old. I owned scrubs older than my relationship with my parents. And some animal part of me, some 18-year-old girl still standing on a dark porch doing math, sat up at the sound of my mother's voice saying, "I've missed you," the way a dog sits up when it hears keys at the door. I knew what this was. Let me be clear, I knew. I had watched this woman price a stroke victim's house from a hospital visitor chair. But people ask afterward, "Why would you even go?" Here's the truest answer I have. You can know exactly what someone is and still be starving for them. Estrangement doesn't kill the hunger. Just teaches you to eat around it. So I said yes. I told myself I was doing reconnaissance. I ironed a blouse like it was armor. drove 40 minutes to Dayton, and pulled up to a brick house with no porch light burning. I sat in my old chair at my mother's table. And for 1 hour, I'll admit this to you and to nobody else. It was nice. The pot roast was the same. The stories were the same. My dad laughed at my jokes. For a little while I could almost pretend 10 years had never happened. Then the dessert plates came out. Next to my slice of pie, my mother placed a plastic-bound folder. The cover page read Woods Family Wealth Management Plan, in a font that looked like it belonged on a bank brochure. My mother had built a presentation around my inheritance. Inside, tabbed sections laid out the entire architecture. A family LLC to hold the house, the building, and the investment accounts. Managing members listed as Gregory and Pamela Woods, and a monthly allowance for me. The word allowance was printed in black, aimed at a 28-year-old woman who worked night shifts beside dying strangers. Page 6 contained a signature line with a small plastic arrow pointing directly at where I was supposed to sign my grandmother's life over to the 2 people she had specifically walled out of it. My dad studied his pie. That shadow behind the curtain again, only better lit. My mother talked the entire time in her loan officer voice, using phrases like fiduciary responsibility, asset protection, and long-term family stability. And you're so busy with your work, honey. You shouldn't have to worry about all this. I let her finish. Hospice teaches you that, too, letting people finish. Then I closed the folder, placed it beside my plate, looked directly at my mother and said, I think Nana was very clear about who she trusted. Thank you for dinner. The pot roast was perfect. I'm not signing this. The temperature in that dining room seemed to drop 10 degrees in a single second. My mother stared at me for a long moment, and the softness drained from her face like someone had flipped a switch at the main breaker. What remained was the woman from that courthouse parking lot in 2014. We tried the nice way, she said. I picked up my purse and let myself out through the dark porch. If you've ever sat at a table where love came with paperwork, tell me in the comments what you did, because I read everyone. And stay with me, because that night I made an enemy on purpose for the first time in my life. And you're about to see exactly what it cost them. If you're new here, subscribe, because this is where the story stops being polite. 3 weeks later, a man in a golf shirt walked up to the nurse's station at the hospice office, asked if I was Ensley Woods, and handed me a manila envelope in front of 2 co-workers and a grieving family. You've been served. Have a good one. I read it in my car outside the probate court in Coron County, Ohio, and my hands went cold on the steering wheel. Gregory Woods and Pamela Woods, petitioners, contesting the last will and trust of Marlene Woods. The grounds made my stomach turn. Undue influence by a caregiver, lack of testamentary capacity. 11 pages of legal language rearranging my entire life into a crime. The beautiful granddaughter had been recast as a professional caregiver, who isolated a dying woman from her loving son and manipulated her into leaving $3.5 million to herself. They wanted Nana's trust thrown out. They wanted the estate distributed as though no valid estate plan existed, which, under Ohio law, could potentially put Nana's assets back into the hands of her son. And buried inside the motions was the real tell, the sentence carrying my mother's fingerprints. Petitioners further request the court appoint them interim managers of the estate during these proceedings. Manage it for you. She had found a way to say it in legal stationery until the entire estate was sorted out. Everything froze. The accounts, the property, all of it caught in limbo while the court decided whether my grandmother had been of sound mind. A question Nana would have found hilarious before filing it away somewhere for future revenge. Harriet called me that evening. Her voice was level in the way I had learned to lean on. They have every legal right to file this, she said. That's the ugly beauty of the law, Ensley. Any fool can knock on the courthouse door. Now come to my office. Your grandmother left some instructions about this exact knock. Before I could even get there, the family phone tree was already working. You have to understand how a smear moves through a small county. It doesn't march. Seeps. My aunt in Columbus heard I had gotten myself written into the will. A great uncle heard I had been medicating Marlene during her final months. You know, she was a nurse. By Friday, a woman at Hartman's grocery looked at me for a little too long across the cart corral, and I knew my mother's version of me had beaten me to the checkout line. Then Kayla texted, the cousin I had taught to parallel park, the girl whose prom dress Nana had hemmed for free. Hey, I just think you should do the right thing and share. They're your parents. Aunt Pam says you'll be hearing from the lawyers anyway. I stared at the message for a long time. I typed a response and deleted it twice. Then I put the phone face down. When I picked it up an hour later, I had been blocked. Ally removed from the board. That one cost me something real. I wanted that on the record because eventually it cost her more than money, though not in a way you could put on a balance sheet. There's no coupon for discovering you stood on the wrong side when it mattered. That Sunday, I sat in my apartment above the hardware store with the lights off, my phone face down on the table, when someone knocked. Ruth Delgato stood in my hallway holding a pot of chicken soup with both hands like it was a casserole-shaped weapon. Her eyes were dry, furious. "You're not answering your phone," she said, pushing past me toward the stove. "So I'll say it here. Marlene told us this would happen. All of it, honey. Every move they're making." She called it us, and that word caught me. Marlene had prepared other people, too. I wanted to know everything, but Ruth only patted my hand and said, "Harriet does the explaining in this outfit. I just do the soup." 2 things happened that week. First, Harriet, acting as trustee, asked me to move into Nana's house. An occupied house is an insured house. An empty one is a liability, and this court fight could take a year. My parents' lawyer objected immediately. Of course he did. But Harriet only smiled, opened a file and told me, "Your grandmother didn't leave you just the property, Ensley. She left you instructions for what to do when they came smiling." And suddenly Nana's final promise began to make sense. When my parents' attorney asked whether I had ever been admitted to a psychiatric facility, voluntarily or otherwise, the court reporter's hands kept moving and the camera kept its red eye on me. 10 years earlier, I had spent 72 hours in a behavioral health unit after I broke under the weight of nursing school, double shifts, and the silence of 2 parents who had decided I was no longer their responsibility. I had told exactly one living soul about it. No one. Not even Nana. I had buried that November so deeply that I almost convinced myself it had never happened. But now, sitting across from a lawyer paid to turn ordinary pieces of my life into evidence, I realized my parents had found that locked drawer and handed him the key. The way they got it was stupidly simple. My mother had apparently discovered the hospitalization while digging through old paperwork during their preparation for the probate case, and instead of seeing a frightened 19-year-old who had recognized she needed help, they saw ammunition. Voss leaned forward slightly. "You were admitted voluntarily." "Yes." "For mental health treatment." "Yes." "And you were prescribed medication." "For a short period." "And during that time, were you experiencing emotional instability?" I looked at him across the table. "I was 19, I said. I was exhausted, overwhelmed, and I asked for help." He made a note. "So you acknowledge that you have a history of psychiatric treatment." "I acknowledge that I once needed help." There was a pause. It was the first moment in 2 hours when his reasonable voice lost its rhythm. He tried another angle. "Would you agree that someone with a history of emotional instability might be vulnerable to becoming overly attached to an elderly relative?" I looked at the camera, then at the court reporter, then back at him. "I would agree that someone who has been abandoned by her parents might understand exactly what it means to stay when somebody is vulnerable." He didn't like that answer. I could tell because his pen stopped. He recovered quickly and returned to questions about Nana. How often I visited, whether I cooked for her, whether I knew her medications, whether I had ever driven her to the bank, whether she had ever discussed her finances with me. Every ordinary act of love was being rearranged into something sinister. Then he asked, "Did your grandmother ever tell you she intended to leave you her estate?" "No." "Did you know about the trust?" "No." "Did you know she had appointed Harriet Cole as trustee?" "No." "Did you ever ask her about her finances?" "No." "Why not?" Elmo smiled. "Because she was my grandmother, not my investment account." The court reporter's fingers moved faster. Voss stared at me for a moment before asking, "Did you ever discuss your parents with your grandmother?" "Yes." "Did you express anger toward them?" "Yes." "Did you tell your grandmother you believed they had mistreated you?" "Yes." "And did that influence her decision to exclude them?" "I don't know. You'd have to ask her. But she is dead." "Exactly." That answer landed harder than I intended. He closed one folder and opened another. "Miss Woods, isn't it true that your grandmother suffered from congestive heart failure in the final year of her life?" "Yes." "And isn't it true that you were employed by the hospice agency providing her care?" "Yes, but I was never her nurse." "You had access to her home?" "Yes." "You had access to her medications?" "As her granddaughter, yes. Her nurse managed them." "You were present during the final months of her life?" "Yes." He folded his hands. "Wouldn't you agree that this created an opportunity for undue influence?" I looked at him and thought about the porch light, the green kitchen table, Nana's pancakes, the mechanical timer ticking behind the fuse box. 10 years of a woman keeping a promise to a girl whose own parents had decided love was something that could be invoiced. "An opportunity," said. "Maybe. But opportunity isn't influence." He raised an eyebrow. "What's the difference?" "Influence means I changed her decision. Opportunity just means I was there." For the first time, he had nothing immediate to say. He looked down at his notes, then back at me. "No further questions at this time." The deposition ended after nearly 3 hours. I walked outside into the August heat and sat in my car without starting it. My hands were shaking, but not because I was afraid anymore. I was angry. Not at Voss. He was doing his job. Not even at my mother, although God knew I had enough reasons. I was angry at the 19-year-old version of myself who had believed needing help was something shameful. I had spent 10 years believing that 72 hours in a hospital made me weak. My parents had spent one afternoon proving exactly how much they knew about strength. But I didn't know yet that the worst part of that deposition wasn't the question about the psychiatric unit. It was what happened 3 weeks later when we finally walked into Judge Marsh's courtroom, because that was the morning Harriet opened the folder Nana had forbidden everyone from seeing, and the first words the judge read aloud were written in Nana's unmistakable handwriting. At 19, I was still listed on my father's health insurance, and the statements went directly to the policyholder. They had known for 10 years. They had known about those 72 hours and said nothing, then saved the information for the day they thought they could use it against me. I heard my lawyer object to relevance, but I answered anyway, keeping my voice level, the same voice I use at 4 in the morning with frightened patients. Yes. In 2015, for 3 days, I checked myself in, and I checked myself out. Voss made a small note, pleased, then quoted my mother without knowing it, or maybe knowing it exactly. "Debts of gratitude are still debts. Wouldn't you agree?" I didn't answer that one. When the deposition ended, he squared his papers like a man clearing a dinner table and said, "We'll see you at the hearing, Miss Woods, unless your family would rather settle this like a family." In the parking garage, my hands finally started shaking. 2 weeks later, my supervisor called me in before my shift and couldn't look me in the eye. An anonymous complaint had been filed with the Ohio Board of Nursing alleging elder financial abuse by a hospice professional. Anonymous, but it cited the probate case number, so we can retire the mystery of who filed it. And here's what people don't understand about licensed work. It doesn't matter how absurd the complaint is. The board has to investigate. The process can take months, and while it grinds forward, an agency that cares for dying patients can't keep a nurse on duty while she's under an abuse investigation. Nobody was cruel about it. That almost made it worse. My supervisor's voice wobbled when she asked for my badge, and I unclipped it and set it on her desk. 6 years of night shifts, reduced to a rectangle of laminate, and then I walked out through the lobby beneath a wall that said, "Dignity," in 4 languages. That's when I understood what they'd found. The trust was a fortress, so they'd stopped shooting at the fortress. They were shooting at me. My nursing license was the one thing I'd built entirely alone. No inheritance, no family help, 12-hour nights and a state exam. And my parents had figured out that it was the one thing of mine the court couldn't protect. By then my savings were nearly gone too. The trust could pay Harriet to defend the trust. That's how the law worked. But the trust couldn't pay for my private attorney or my professional defense. And nearly $18,000 of my $21,000 in savings had already gone out the door. That night I sat in my car outside Nana's house and watched the porch light click on at 7, right on schedule. A dead woman keeping her promise while I figured out how to keep mine. Then an email arrived from Voss's office. His clients, it said, remained open to a family resolution. The people who had started the fire were now selling me extinguishers. If your family has ever turned the law into a weapon, tell me in the comments. I read every one. And stay close because the next hearing is the one from the title, the one where the judge turned the page. Subscribe so you don't miss what was on it. The preliminary hearing took place in October inside a small oak-paneled courtroom at the Corrin County Courthouse. Judge Ellen Marsh presided, a woman around 60 with the patience of someone who had heard every version of every family story. My parents sat at the petitioner's table in their church clothes. My mother looked serene. She whispered something to Voss and smiled, scanning the room like it already belonged to her. And honestly, I think in her mind this was the finish line, the day the court would finally hand a responsible adult the keys. Judge Marsh put on her glasses and quietly paged through Nana's trust. Then she stopped. "Counsel," she said to Voss, "before we schedule anything, has your client read Article 9 of this instrument?" Then she read it aloud into the record, her courtroom voice carrying all the way to the last row. Article 9. If any beneficiary of this trust contests its validity or seeks control of its assets through legal proceedings, that beneficiary forfeits any and all interest granted herein. The $10,000 bequests to Gregory and Pamela Woods were conditional. Contest the trust and the gift disappeared. My mother's smile held because $10,000 meant nothing compared with $3.5 million. But the judge wasn't finished. "There is an attached statement of intent," she said, "executed and notarized January of 2024. The testator requests that it be read aloud in open court in the event of any challenge." She turned the page toward herself. Then she began reading Nana's words. From Marlene Woods. In 2014, my son Gregory and his wife Pamela petitioned to have me declared incompetent so they could manage my affairs. Court said no. I have spent the last 10 years making sure the answer stays no. If they are in your courtroom challenging my judgment now, I ask you to remember that they already showed you exactly what they intend to do with control. The courtroom went completely still. My mother stopped smiling. And I finally understood why Nana had insisted Harriet speak first, why the documents had been built years before anyone knew this day was coming, and why she had wanted the judge, not me, to turn that page. Because Nana hadn't just left me her estate. She had left the court a memory. Now they had come after my death, smiling, offering to manage what I had left behind. I ask you to read this page to them so they understand that I am, one final time, ahead of them. The silence was total and I watched it happen. The thing from the title. My mother's smile didn't break. It simply drained from her eyes, like something had been unplugged. My grandmother had predicted their exact move in writing 16 months before they made it, and every stranger in that courtroom had just heard her say so from beyond the grave. Voss rose anyway and asked for an evidentiary hearing on undue influence, because if the trust itself fell, Article 9 fell with it. Judge Marsh granted it, set the hearing for 6 weeks out, and I would swear on the green kitchen table that she looked at my parents for half a second longer than necessary. In the hallway afterward, my mother walked straight toward me, her perfume unchanged, and said quietly enough that only I could hear, "You think a dead woman can protect you?" 3 nights later, my dad came to the house alone. I found him standing at the bottom of the porch steps inside the circle of light, not knocking, a 59-year-old man holding his car keys like a hat. I stayed in the doorway. He looked older than he had at the funeral. "Your mother wasn't always like this," he said. Then he told me a story I'd never heard in all my years as their daughter. My mother's mother died in 1991 when Mom was 23. There was no estate. There was a shoebox, bills, collection notices, a repossessed car, and a funeral nobody could afford. My mother worked 3 jobs to bury her own mother and spent 2 years paying off a dead woman's debts. She came out of that experience with one conviction welded into her. Money left loose is a knife left on the floor, and the person who grabs it first and controls it is the person who loves the family most. She thinks she's protecting you, Dad said, from ending up like her mother. She can't hear how it sounds. For a second, standing in Nana's doorway, I saw it, the whole sad machine of it. A scared 23-year-old building a ledger so the floor could never fall out again. And I felt the pull of that old ache. I want you to know that pity is real, even when it changes nothing. Because here's what I said. And you? What's your story? He looked down at his keys. The shadow behind the curtain. The silence behind the newspaper. 40 years of if you think it's best, Pam. Then he finally said, just give her something, Ensley. She'll stop. We can be done. Not I'm sorry. Not she's wrong. An installment plan. I said goodnight and closed the door gently. 3 days later, my mother offered me the one thing money can't buy. And I almost took it. It came in her handwriting for pages, and it was the letter I had been writing for her in my head for 10 years. Ensley, my firstborn. Not a day has passed. We can withdraw everything, the case, the complaint, all of it. Tomorrow come home. Sunday dinners. Christmas. The room. We'll be a family again, the way your grandmother would have wanted. All we ask is that the estate be divided fairly and managed properly by all of us together. I sat under the porch light with those pages until 2 in the morning. I'm not going to perform strength for you here. I read it 9 or 10 times. The animal in my chest, the one that still sat up at the sound of my mother's voice on the phone, was howling because this was the actual prize, wasn't it? Not the money. The door reopened. The ledger burned. My mother and father at a table with me, nobody keeping score. I had testified against them at 17 and been billed for it ever since. And here was the invoice marked paid in full. All it would cost was everything Nana had spent 10 years building, handed over to the people she had built it to protect me from, plus one signature agreeing that their love had been a reasonable price all along. Toward dawn, I understood that the letter was the deposition again, just written in softer font. My mother had given herself away with 2 words. Managed properly. She came the next morning for my answer, and I met her on the porch beneath the light she had once tried to take from me. I kept my voice as low as hers had ever been. You can't buy back what you threw away, Mom. And I'm done paying interest on being your daughter. Something in her face closed like a bank at 5. She walked to her car, and from the open door, she gave me one last look. Then you'll lose the license too, she said. And that was the last conversation my mother and I ever had as mother and daughter. The formal offer arrived the following week on Voss letterhead, and it was elegant the way a trap is elegant. $700,000, styled as a family settlement in exchange for full withdrawal of the will contest. But one paragraph lower was the sentence that had been aimed at me all along. It has been our client's experience that licensing matters tend to resolve themselves when families reconcile. Translation: pay us and the board complaint evaporates. Fight us and it doesn't. And if I fought, Voss noted almost apologetically, my medical history from November 2015 would be subpoenaed and examined in open court in a county where the newspaper still printed probate news between the football scores. Understand the math I was staring at. $700,000 was 20% of the estate, and Harriet believed we would win, but believed it in the careful way lawyers believe things. Meanwhile, the board investigation could grind on for a year or more with my nursing badge sitting in a drawer. My savings were down to $3,000, and the price of winning was standing in front of my hometown while a lawyer read my psychiatric records aloud. My own attorney, the one I was paying with money I didn't really have, told me plainly that taking the deal was the rational move. You'd keep 80% and your privacy. I've seen people pay more for less. Even the math of surrender was reasonable. That's what a good trap looks like. Harriet was quiet for a long time when I asked her what she thought. The trust can survive a trial, she finally said. That was built. The question, Ensley, is whether you want to. Nobody gets to grade you on that answer. They sent a draft agreement with a signature line and a little plastic arrow. My mother's arrow, pointing at where I was supposed to end it. That night, I sat at Nana's green table and picked up the pen. I had the agreement flat in front of me, the pen uncapped, and I want to be honest. I had decided to sign it. 20% to make it stop. People pay more for less. My hand was actually moving when someone knocked. It was Ruth, with Carmen behind her holding a pie like a second opinion. They didn't ask what the papers were. Gray-haired women don't have to. They sat at the table where they'd sat all winter, and Ruth placed her hand flat on the pages. Not grabbing them, just resting there like you'd rest a hand on a casket. Let me tell you what I watched for 10 years, she said. Every evening at 7 that porch light came on. Rain, snow, the night of Nana's diagnosis, the night she died. Ruth used to check it from her kitchen window like a lighthouse. One time she asked Nana why she didn't simply leave it burning all day. Nana had answered, "Because then it wouldn't mean anything, Ruthie. Has to be a choice. It has to cost a little every single day, or it's not a promise. It's just a bulb." Carmen cut the pie without asking. "She wasn't leaving you money, honey," Ruth said. "Money was the smallest thing in that house. She was leaving you witnesses." I looked at the signature line and the little plastic arrow, and Ruth asked the question I've thought about every day since. "You've been paying for their love your whole life, Ensley. Whatever this paper costs, add it to that pile. What's the interest rate?" I sat with that. Then I picked up the agreement, squared the pages the way Voss had, and tore them in half. The sound was the best thing I'd heard since Nana laughed. Nobody at that table knew what I was going to do instead. Not even me, until I said it out loud. To beat their story, I have to tell mine. All of it. Under oath. Here's what I understood at that table. Their entire arsenal, the deposition, the complaint, the settlement letter, all of it ran on one fuel. My silence. Those 72 hours were only a weapon while I treated them like a wound. A secret can be extorted. A story can't. So the next morning, I sat in Harriet's office and gave her my instructions. And for once in my life, I didn't soften them. No settlement. No counteroffer. No delay. And then came the part that made my own lawyer blink. I would sign a waiver and release my behavioral health records myself. I voluntarily released them into the case before Voss could subpoena a single page. You cannot threaten to expose what a woman has already laid on the table in her own handwriting. The blackmail died with that signature. 18 months of leverage disappeared in one stroke of a pen my parents never saw coming, because people who keep ledgers cannot imagine giving away the thing they could charge the most for. Then we built the witness list, and it wasn't lawyers. It was Dr. Patel and 20 years of charts. It was Dana, the hospice nurse who actually managed Nana's care. And it was the green table, Ruth, Carmen, and the whole gray-haired nation of Maple Glen. The people who had watched that porch light burn for 11 years and knew exactly who it burned for. Harriet studied the list for a long moment. "Your grandmother said you'd get here," she said. "She hoped it wouldn't cost this much." The night before the hearing, I ironed my scrubs out of habit, stood there holding the uniform I wasn't allowed to wear, then hung it back up and chose the gray dress instead. In 6 hours, the whole county would hear about the worst night of my life. And they would hear it from me first. The evidentiary hearing opened in November, and the courtroom was full, which in Corrin County meant the church crowd, the diner crowd, and a reporter from the county paper with a fresh legal pad. Voss went first, and I'll give the man this. He was good. For an entire day, he built a woman out of my outline. A trained medical professional embedded in a dying widow's home, with access to her routines, moods, and medications, a granddaughter with a documented psychiatric history who stood to gain $3.5 million from an old woman's allegedly altered estate plan. My mother testified in a blue suit with a tissue clenched in her fist, and she was devastating. Poised, wounded, reasonable. We only ever wanted to manage things properly. Ensley is fragile. She's been fragile for years. We were trying to protect her and my mother-in-law both. She had grieved more convincingly on that stand than she had at the casket. Then Kayla, my 26-year-old cousin, testified while avoiding my eyes. She said I had kept to myself and gotten close to Mrs. Woods near the end. 2 innocent facts arranged into fingerprints. That was the day I learned you can lose a person twice. The judge listened to all of it without revealing a thing. Ruth sat behind me the whole day, and behind her Carmen, and behind Carmen, 3 rows of gray heads that had no legal function at all except that Judge Marsh could count them. When they adjourned, Voss packed his briefcase looking like a man ahead on points. Honestly, he was. Judge Marsh looked over her glasses. Ms. Woods, the court will hear you tomorrow morning at 9. That night, the porch light clicked on at 7, and I sat beneath it and practiced nothing because Nana always said, the truth doesn't need rehearsal. It just needs a witness willing to go first. I took the stand at 9 the next morning in the gray dress. And I used the only voice I own, the 4 in the morning voice, the one I use for frightened people in dark rooms, low and level and unhurried. And I told it. All of it. October 2014. 2 weeks past my 18th birthday. The key that wouldn't turn. 2 suitcases packed by my mother. Sweaters folded because she folds everything. Even abandonment. My father's shape behind the curtain. My mother's voice through the 4-inch opening of the door. Family is a ledger, Ensley. And you are deep in the red. I watched the court reporter type my mother's sentence into the permanent record of the state of Ohio. I told them about the 6-block walk in the dark and the porch light coming on. And then, because it was mine to tell now, I told them about November 2015. 19 years old. 13 months into exile. The night my hands wouldn't stop and my thoughts turned into a drain. The drive I made alone to the county hospital. The form I signed alone. The 72 hours. The form I signed to leave alone. Counsel has called me fragile, I said. I looked at nobody except Judge Marsh, and I kept my voice exactly where I keep it at a bedside. I checked myself in at 19 with no one to call. I checked myself out, finished nursing school, and spent 6 years sitting with this county's dying. I'm told that's a psychiatric history. On my ward, we call it surviving. Then Harriet stood and read my waiver into the record. Every page of those records, released by me voluntarily weeks earlier. I watched the leverage my parents had mined from my worst night turn into vapor in a silent courtroom. Last, the dates were laid out plain. The trust was created in March 2015, 5 months after the porch. It was amended for the final time in January 2024, 9 months before Nana's diagnosis, with 2 independent doctors certifying her capacity that same week. My grandmother didn't change her plan because I got close to her money. She changed it because she watched them come for hers. I stepped down from the stand. My mother was staring at me, and behind all that composure, something had begun very quietly to slide. Then came the afternoon I want read at my funeral. Dr. Patel, 20 years of charts, 2 capacity letters, and the flat professional opinion that Marlene Woods possessed a degree of financial acumen exceeding my own. Dana, the hospice nurse of record, walked the court through every medication log and every visit note, confirming under oath that I had never once handled Nana's chart, medications, or paperwork, and that I was listed in the file simply as family. And then the gray-haired nation of Maple Glen took the stand one by one, and the courtroom stopped being Voss's. Carmen, who'd fed half the county, told Judge Marsh that Marlene planned this trust the way she planned everything. Sober as a hymn and twice as loud. And Ruth, 71 years old, hands folded, 30 years next door, testified about the porch light. The timer installed in October 2014. The bulb she watched from her kitchen window every evening for 11 years. Rain, snow, holidays, even the night Marlene died, it was still burning. That light was for the girl, she said. Everyone on Sycamore Street knew what it meant. It meant that child had a home whether her parents wanted her or not. Voss tried to cross-examine her. He suggested elderly neighbors could misremember things. Ruth looked at him over her glasses the way you'd look at gum stuck to a pew. Old women notice things, young man. It's all we do. The gallery laughed, and Judge Marsh let them. And that's when my mother broke. Not a scream at first. Correction. She stood at the petitioner's table despite Voss's hand closing around her arm, because a courtroom full of people were smiling at a version of the family where she was the villain. And my mother had never once lost control of a narrative in her life. "We fed her for 18 years, she said, too loudly for the room. "You don't get to walk away from a debt like that. Family is a ledger." It is. And there it was. 50 strangers, a court reporter, and a judge had just heard my mother state the household religion out loud in her own voice, the exact sentence from the porch, and no one had extracted it from her. She'd offered it. Judge Marsh called a 30-minute recess. When she returned, she had the trust in one hand and a ruling in the other. Judge Marsh read from the bench, and she did not hurry. The petition to invalidate the trust of Marlene Woods is denied with prejudice. On capacity, the court found 2 independent, contemporaneous medical certifications and the testimony of a treating physician of 20 years against 0 medical evidence from the petitioners. On undue influence, the court found, and these were the words that mattered to me, no evidence whatsoever that the beneficiary influenced this estate plan, and abundant evidence that the plan was a response of many years standing to the petitioner's own prior conduct. The trust stood. Every bolt Nana had tightened held. Then came Article 9. The court found that the contest had been brought without probable cause, which under the clause meant the conditional bequests were forfeited. My parents had sued for $3.5 million, and the arithmetic of their ambition came due at 0. Minus the $10,000 each my grandmother had left them as bait, minus their own legal fees. And the court noted for the record that it would entertain the trustees' motion to recover fees from the petitioners. My mother took the sound of all this the way you take a diagnosis. My father took it looking at his keys. Outside, in the hallway by the tall windows, she crossed to me one last time. Up close, her composure had cracks in it now, fine ones like a windshield the morning after a cold night. And she said, and I believe it was the truest thing she ever said to me after everything, "Then consider us settled." Not sorry. Not even angry, really. Just the ledger opened to my page one final time. I heard my own voice come out the way it does when I turn off a monitor that's done its work. Quiet and finished. "Then consider us settled." I walked past her through the doors into the November cold, and I did not look back. And this is the part where It was supposed to feel like victory. Instead, it felt like a discharge. Somebody I'd been treating my whole life had finally been released. I want to be straight with you about the price because every win has won, and the videos that skip this part are lying to you. The county paper ran the story on page 2. My name, the trust, and one paragraph sourced from the public record that exposed the truth about a 19-year-old girl in 72 hours in a behavioral health unit. For a week, people at Hartman's looked at me 1 second too long, and I let them. That was the cost of taking the weapon away, and I'd pay it again. But I did pay it. Privacy once spent doesn't refund. That night, I sat beneath the porch light and took out my phone. I found the contact that still said Mom and Dad, a habit 10 years dead. I didn't block the number. Blocking is for doors people might knock on. I simply deleted it. The screen asked if I was sure, and for the first time in my adult life the answer was clean. The girl who kept a door cracked open for them was gone. I'd left her on the stand, under oath, where she finally got to matter. 6 weeks after the ruling, the Board of Nursing closed the complaint as unsubstantiated, and my supervisor handed my badge back across her desk with wet eyes and a speech she couldn't finish. On my first shift back, an 80-pound farm widow held my hand at 3 a.m. and told me I had calm hands. I had to step into the hallway for a minute on my own time. The house became fully mine when the appeal window closed, and I did what Nana would have done with it, which is to say, nothing dramatic and everything deliberate. The green table filled again on Sunday mornings. Ruth, Carmen, and the gray-haired nation of Maple Glen. Pancakes on the old griddle. Coffee still criminally weak because some recipes are load-bearing. The rent from the Spool and Thimble building, $3,800 a month, goes into something Harriet helped me establish called the Marlene Fund. It pays for respite care, a weekend off, a paid aide, Or a tank of gas for family caregivers in Corrin County, the daughters and granddaughters sleeping in recliners beside hospital beds. No applications longer than 1 page. No payback. Ever. House rule. In the spring, 1 envelope arrived from Dayton. My father's handwriting was the only thing on it. Inside was a check for $3,900, which meant nothing until I did the math. Then it meant everything. $150 a month from 16 to 18. He had refunded the room and board to the dollar, with 1 line on a sticky note. I'm sorry. I didn't tear it up and I didn't call. I signed it over to the fund, where it bought 11 exhausted caregivers a weekend of sleep, which is the only interest that debt could ever pay. And in June, Ruth showed up on the porch with a girl named Nadia, 18, a nursing student whose parents had put her belongings in garbage bags over a boy and a Pell Grant. I heard myself say the rent was $1 a year. And no, she couldn't owe me. House rule. Then I went to the hardware store and had a key cut. Handing it to her felt like the entire estate changing hands for the second time. Correctly. Tonight, it's late September again, coming up on 12 years since those 2 suitcases sat on a porch. Through the kitchen window, I can see Nadia at the green table with her anatomy flashcards, wearing my old sweatshirt and eating pancakes she didn't pay for. At exactly 7, the timer in the hall closet gives its little click, the same click it has given every evening since 2014, and the porch light comes on over Sycamore Street. Here is everything I know, and it fits in 1 sentence. Love doesn't keep books. Keeps a light on. And a light, it turns out, can outlive the hand that lit it. That's my story. 2 suitcases on a porch. 1 page a judge read out loud. 1 porch light that never went out. If somebody turned love into a ledger on you, hear me. You don't owe them your life, and you're allowed to stop paying interest on it. If this found you on a hard night, share it with someone sitting in the dark, and go check on the person who keeps a light on for you. Drop a comment, I read every one. Hit subscribe and I'll see you in the next.